All right, so we're in episode 2 of Justice for the Foreigner. We are picking it back up with Matt Soerens with World Relief, and we are going to just follow up with some questions. Matt did an awesome presentation last episode for us. We talked about some stats. We talked about a lot of data that help us understand the complexities of the problem the problems that face foreigners in this country. We talked about some misconceptions. We talked about just how this issue is a justice issue so often, and how that can look so many different ways. But now we're going to dive into the focus for today is going to be on what the church can do about it. Tom is going to facilitate as always, and so take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Chris. And as you said, today we're going to try to focus on ways that we can approach this topic, how the church can get involved, things that we can do. But before we get entirely into solutions, I did want to touch on one aspect of the foreigner that we did not really speak about last week in detail, at least, and that is the language barrier that comes with being in a foreign land and not growing up speaking that language and having to face the challenge of being in a land where the language is different. So, Matt, from your perspective, how important is having a shared language integrating into a new land? Like, for instance, do you see where people migrate to a different country where they speak the same or similar language, they face significant less trouble than if they're going to a foreign language speaking country?
Yeah, I mean, certainly language is, I mean, it's all wrapped up with culture, but just in terms of basic communication, it's really challenging to be in a place where you don't know how to communicate or don't know how to communicate beyond a very basic level. And any of us who've traveled, to other contexts, and even as a tourist or, on a short-term trip of some sort, have probably experienced that. Like, if you didn't have someone to translate, it's intimidating to not know how to even place an order at a restaurant, or should you have to interact with a doctor, understand what's happening. And I think in my experience, most immigrants in the United States are very eager to learn English. Some of them do so much more quickly than others. And a lot of that is based in, like, for one thing, just the way that God made our human brains. If you come as a 5-year-old, I almost guarantee you're going to speak the language within a few years. If you come as a 75-year-old, realistically, you're probably not going to learn a new language. Like, that's fairly rare. And it's also an effect of exposure to language in the past. Like, if you come to the United States and you speak 3 languages, learning English as your 4th is probably actually going to be a lot easier than if you were, did not have access to education and are not literate in any language. And we, the ministry we do at World Relief, we serve refugees who are across that. We have refugees who are refugees because they served as translators for the U.S. military in Iraq. So, they already speak English quite well, and often with like doctoral degrees. And on the other hand, we have people who part of the persecution that they experienced was not being allowed to go to school in their lives. And that was the way their government was mistreating them, among other things. So that, we've really had to differentiate the way even we do language instruction, because it's very different with someone who's not literate in any language. I mean, if you can just imagine learning a new language when you have never learned how to read at all. So it's really vital. And that's an important role for the church, is just having native, fluent English speakers who will be patient with people through the confusion that inevitably results while you're learning a new language. And the best way to learn a language is ultimately to practice it, and that requires someone with whom you can practice. So we've seen that as actually a really great entry point for a lot of churches to be engaged in serving immigrant communities, is to help people learning English language.
Yeah, so that jumps into my next question. What are the best ways for the church to reach across the language barrier to be more inclusive of their immigrant or refugee or otherwise foreigner population? Is it just teaching language? Is it maybe broadcasting or translating your messages into multiple languages, or maybe other things that we're not thinking about? How can the church best reach out to bridge the language gap?
Yeah, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that, because I've seen different churches try different models. I've been in churches where you've got the headset to basically simultaneous translation, or other churches have said we're going to do a Bible study in this language, or do a separate worship service in this language. That makes sense to me. I mean, I've spent time overseas where it was sort of a refreshing part of my week to go worship with people in English, just because I didn't have to think so hard in what's a second language to me. But at the same time, I think it's really vital that as we, maybe we're praying in our first language, uh, we're also creating opportunities for people to build relationships across some of those language barriers. So obviously having people who can translate is really vital. And then just being sensitive to, sometimes it's as simple as maybe it's not everything is translated orally, but the words are on a screen in another language, or even on the screen in English. For me, it's a lot easier to track something in Spanish, which is my second language, if I can read it along instead of just only having to listen to it. So being as sensitive as possible to, that's not going to work probably with a sermon, but like with a worship song or something like that, where that's something that can be done in advance. Um, that's been my experience, that people are eager to learn, but it's hard work to learn a new language, especially for very newly arrived folks.
And do you see a lot of churches hosting or participating in programs dedicated to teaching foreigners the native language?
Yeah, definitely. And obviously in the U.S. context, that's English, but we work with churches in other parts of the world where it's learning another language. Some of my colleagues in Kenya were talking about Swahili as a second language classes um, for Somali refugees. But I think that, yeah, it's a great entry point. And there's a pedagogy to learning a second language. So I think the ideal sort of English language instruction program is really focused on both building relationships, but also really helping people learn the language well, and doing that with as much excellence as anyone else.
And outside of the language issue, what about incorporating other cultural elements from your foreign-born population, uh, either into your church's service or their outreach, such as, say, music, food, other cultural elements? What have you seen churches do to include the foreigner more in their collective worship, their collective fellowship, and how is that best executed in your experience?
Yeah, both those dynamics, music and food, were probably the first two things I would mention. And music, not only in terms of like culture, but in terms of worship as well. I mean, that we serve a God who, we are told in Revelation, we will one day all be around the throne with people from every tribe and tongue and nation and language. And we in some ways have an opportunity to have a foretaste of that in a country like the United States, where it's relatively unique in our world to have people from so many cultures in one place, which I think is just a great opportunity. A friend of mine, Sandra Van Opstal, has a thoughtful book on worship, and how what it looks like to worship, and to incorporate the worship traditions of different cultures. I think it's called The Next Worship. And then, like, also, like you mentioned, food is I would say food is probably almost like a universal. I mean, not that all food is the same, but every culture eats, and every culture has some pride in the foods that they eat. And I mean, I would say one of my favorite parts of living in an immigrant community is the regularity with which I'm offered food. That's been a little bit less so during the pandemic, but there's also some health risks involved there. I mean, since I moved into an immigrant community, I've probably gained 40 pounds, and I'm not blaming my immigrant neighbors for that, but it's hard to say no to another plate of tacos. But there's so many foods from so many different places, and and receiving that with there's a sense of hospitality of, obviously we want to serve people, but being willing to receive from people, I think, is also really important.
Yeah.
And recognizing the richness that people bring with them to this country, which is the story of the United States. I mean, most foods we think of as American came from somewhere else at some point in our history.
Right, 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 right.
And do you see any pitfalls in trying to incorporate those things into the church community when there's maybe multiple ethnic groups represented in the same community? Like, maybe it's difficult to translate into every possible language that someone who comes to the door might speak, or it's difficult to have music that is native to the culture of everyone, from a foreign-born group that comes through the door. Does that tend to cause any difficulty in incorporating the foreigner group into the body as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the intention is to make people feel welcome, I find that people are really grateful for that. I mean, obviously, we don't want to be sort of like turning it into a performance or a show. That could be maybe sort of uncomfortable, but in general, I find that most immigrant communities, especially in the church, are really grateful for the thoughtfulness of saying, how can we help how can we help communicate to you that you are welcome, that we are embracing you. um, I've shared the example in the past. In my church, I actually go to a Spanish speaking church, so we're the minority there. And a few weeks after we were there, they said, hey, you guys, we know your kids don't speak Spanish that well. My wife and I speak Spanish decently, but we could start translating the service to English. And that was almost like, I really started to think about that. Like, that's just an incredible level of hospitality. I mean, half the church, at least, if not more, is bilingual, right? Plenty of people there speak English, but the worship service is in Spanish. And, for a couple families who are not native Spanish speakers, they were thinking, wait, we could translate this into English just so you would feel more comfortable. And that, it really made me feel, very welcome. And like, basically they're bending over backwards to say, how do we, let you know that you're valued here. And frankly, I think that's fairly rare. I mean, I don't know a lot of churches that would have one family come in that wasn't a native speaker and say, let's start translating the service.
Yeah, right before COVID, well, sort of at the beginning of last summer, I should say, when it was kind of, there was, for some of us who were maybe more naive, when we thought, oh, we're going to be back meeting like regular in the fall, we were talking about doing translation into Spanish for our services. But things didn't go back to normal. We couldn't get back into the building we've used, and we've kind of been nomads a bit. So we had to put that on hold. But it does make me wonder, our district right now, our metro district, is now zeroing in on the experiences of Asian Americans and learning more about what they've gone through and in their past. And, they tend to get overlooked a bit. They don't often, at least in my experience, don't get the same attention that other minority groups have gotten. And this, if you don't mind, Tom, just kind of a piggyback off of this topic. How should a church discern between when to pull the trigger on like something like a translation or highlighting a particular minority group versus trying to be all things to every minority that could be possibly represented? You know what I mean? Is there a benefit to, should a church, I guess is what I'm asking, say, you know what, you got to pick one at a time who you're going to serve because you can't do it all effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my attitude would be to start with who's there and asking them what would be helpful. I mean, there may be people who would be really grateful to have a service translated. There might be others who might be, tell you in English, actually, I'm more comfortable in English than in whatever other language, you might presume that I speak. So, I think it's just having the humility to say, we are so glad you're here. We would love to make our congregation more comfortable for as many people as possible. Do you have ideas of what might help celebrate, various cultures, whether that's language or worship styles, or, maybe it's as simple as a potluck where people bring what food is normal to them and then, sharing in that together. But I would start with the people who are already there and asking them what would help, what would this be helpful and encouraging or not? And, letting them tell you what they're thinking.
Right.
For action points, for things that we want to actually do in our community and our churches, Matt, in your experience, what programs, it doesn't necessarily have to be with language, what programs in general or services in general that the churches and church communities in your area have run have been the most effective at coming alongside the foreign-born population? Again, it doesn't have to relate to language per se, although it can.
Sure.
If you can give us some examples.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, it's going to vary a little bit based on what, who the immigrants in your community are, where they're coming from, what supports and services are already there. And so it's always good to start by sort of doing that assessment of what's already in the community, what are sort of the felt needs. But for example, some things we've seen in some communities, like a big need in some, well, for newly arrived folks, like the refugee resettlement model is something that World Relief has been really involved in. Basically, this is, people who are arriving in a new country, often without really knowing anyone. And I would say kind of the foundational need that people have is friendship. They often are arriving, some of them are arriving to be reunited to family, and they already have that kind of built in, but others don't know anyone in this country. And just to have people who are sort of willing to come alongside them, help them through the normal cultural adjustments, answer questions about why things work this way in this country, or um, things as simple as like going to the grocery store. If that looks really different from what a grocery store is in the context where you came from, can be really helpful. So I think that's one model that the World Relief has been a part of and has really contributed to facilitating some lasting reciprocal friendships. Another need often is legal services. And legal services, I should say, is not something that you should do if you are not an authorized practitioner of law. So it's not something you just, some people need medical care, but if you're not a doctor, you shouldn't just like put up a sign and start offering health advice. The same is true for legal advice. Although it is worth noting that under U.S. immigration law, you can actually become authorized to practice immigration law by becoming accredited by the U.S. Department of Justice as a non-attorney. So anyone who's an attorney in, before a bar in any of the 50 states has at least the legal credentials to practice, to give legal advice on immigration matters. But so does someone, and this is my background actually. My job role is I'm not an attorney, but for a number of years I worked as a legal counselor. And we've had a bunch of church partners that have actually gone through the process to get recognized by the Department of Justice to provide, basically means getting training in the basics of U.S. immigration law.
Huh.
So that's another, again, that's not a need everywhere. Sometimes there's plenty of legal services, but in a lot of communities, there's nothing. And immigration law is incredibly complex. So it is definitely a need for some folks.
Interesting.
I would say another area would be like youth services. And again, some of these aren't needs that are unique to immigrants, but especially in immigrant communities, if I would say in general, a lot of immigrant parents are very focused on education for their kids. It's a very high priority. But if their native language isn't English and their kids are being educated in English, sometimes they feel a little bit unable to help, kids with their homework or that sort of thing. So tutoring programs, we've seen that be a really great opportunity, again, to build relationships and help mentor young people, but also help them make sure they're getting their homework done and, making academic progress as well. Another dynamic, again, this is probably an area that requires some specialized training, not something people should just think that they're qualified for because they heard this podcast or whatever, but a lot of immigrants have gone through some pretty serious trauma, especially refugees or, other categories of immigrants as well. And so counseling opportunities are, a really important opportunity, obviously in ways that are culturally sensitive and linguistically appropriate. But that's something I know some of my World Relief colleagues have been a part of as well, is trauma counseling and helping people especially refugees. By definition, they have fled a credible fear of persecution. And sometimes wasn't just a fear of persecution, but they were persecuted. They were tortured in some cases where, just experienced really horrifying experiences that are a lot to work through. But the good news is God has created human beings to be incredibly resilient. And we see people who've gone through really horrifying situations who are able to work their way through that.
Mm. Wow. So can I just ask, your colleagues at World Relief who have been trained to do that, to do trauma counseling, how do they get connected to somebody who needs it?
Well, so for World Relief, it's usually the folks who come to the U.S. through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. We're connected to them from the day they arrive, and then we can basically refer people over to our counseling center. But that's something I know that we've worked with local churches too. The American Bible Society has a kind of interesting curriculum focused on trauma healing. That's it's like we also have like professionals with doctorates who do this work. But there's some element of this that can be done on more of a lay level as well with some specialized training.
Right.
Excellent. And just to follow up on the legal aspect, the sort of like the legal advocate position that you had, that's available all 50 states. Like anybody can do that through the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yeah, so it's basically to do this, you have to be at a nonprofit organization. So our church obviously qualifies, but it is specifically designed. They don't want you starting this as a business. You can charge no more than nominal fees, and then you go through this recognition process. Usually, kind of the prerequisite to that for an individual, obviously, you have to be an individual associated with a nonprofit, which could be a church. And we have had alliance churches that have done this. We've had a number of churches around the country from different denominational backgrounds. The first step there is usually an intensive 40-hour training, which we're actually doing now online. COVID kind of pushed us to that. We used to always do it in person in kind of a week-long course. But I know we've got a training on that coming up that is an intensive course on U.S. immigration law. And there's a test involved. And then from there, it's possible. That's just the first step. And then you need some on-the-job training. The Wesleyan Church does a really great job of this. And they've been a really helpful partner in terms of providing some, connecting people to other locations where they can do some on-the-job shadowing of a legal counselor. And again, this could be a paid role for a church, but it also can be a volunteer role, with the caveat that it's a very high intensity volunteer role. It's not something you're going to do an hour a month. It's something you're probably, like, where we've seen this work best with volunteers is usually retirees who this actually is their job. They're just not being paid, but they're doing it 20 hours a week, because you kind of have to do it quite a bit to get to know what you're talking about and understand, because immigration law is incredibly complex.
And the technical term for that is just a legal counselor.
Yeah, or I guess it'd be an accredited representative. So they're accredited by the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yeah, I was not aware that even existed. So thank you.
Wow.
And I wouldn't probably recommend that as it's not a dip your toe in the water immigrant ministry. And the 40-hour training will scare people away if they weren't really committed, because it is intensive. But we have seen a number of churches do that. And I mean, I was just on a call actually with a couple churches in Oklahoma today, a Nazarene church and a Wesleyan church that have both started up legal services centers in their churches, a couple days a week. And the beautiful thing is, it's also, I mean, they've had people from, dozens of different countries come through the doors of their church. A few of them, and I've had this experience when I was a legal counselor. Sometimes people are in hard circumstances and it feels appropriate to say, can I pray for you? Would you be comfortable with that? And most people in my experience are usually very grateful for that. And there's opportunities for spiritual conversations sometimes as well. I mean, never with it's not you will now pray this prayer and then I'll fill out your naturalization application. But I remember one specific woman who was just in tears in my office because she was eligible for naturalization, but she just had failed the English test. So I guess she was not eligible, but she met all the other requirements, and she was just so stressed out by the English test she had to take. So I just remember saying, here's the tutors I can connect you to so you can practice, and I'll be praying for you. And can I pray for you now? And it was, a Muslim woman who, was still happy to have me pray for her as a Christian. And there's lots of opportunities like that to interact with people that I think can be really, in some ways you're serving people at a point of real need and vulnerability. It's scary to be in front of an immigration officer who's deciding your future in some ways. So it's a great opportunity as well.
Yeah.
And as a legal counselor, I mean, I could accompany my clients to their immigration interviews, and basically you can actually, there's a few tiers. You can be partially accredited and represent clients before the Department of Homeland Security, which is like a basic naturalization application or a green card. You can also get fully accredited, which I am not, but I have colleagues who are, and actually represent clients in immigration court, which is more intensive and kind of higher stakes, because if they lose their cases, they could be deported.
So a non-attorney can get to the point where they're representing immigration cases in a court of law.
Yep. Now, because our immigration courts, and it's kind of a little in the weeds, but they're not part of the judicial branch. They're part of the executive branch. They're run by the Department of Justice. So it's administrative law. And the U.S. government has basically they made this process because so few immigrants actually have legal representation, because they don't have, unlike this is not a criminal law. It's not where you have the right to an attorney. You don't get assigned a public defender. You have the right to an attorney at your own expense. And if you don't have the money to pay for that, you're basically out of luck unless there's some nonprofit or pro bono attorney who's going to step in. And that's the accreditation program, basically, because you have people who don't have to pay back hundreds of $1,000s in law school loans. You can find people who are motivated more out of a service orientation and they don't have to charge very much.
Wow.
Oh, interesting. And I never knew any of this existed.
Yeah. Jeez.
It's something we would actually love to see. I mean, frankly, the Catholic Church is they've done this for a long time. There's a lot of Catholic programs doing this, a lot fewer Protestant churches that are involved in immigrant legal services, but it's something we've been trying to really help build at World Relief.
Is this particularly concentrated in border states or pretty much spread throughout?
Pretty well spread out, because immigrants may or may not pass through a border, but they're mostly not staying there. So, I mean, and honestly, some of the greatest needs are in communities you wouldn't expect. Like a friend of mine started a legal services center in this little small town in Indiana, Logansport, Indiana. And it happens to have a meatpacking plant, and so there is a pretty significant immigrant population that is basically the majority of the labor force. I think it's poultry processing, but their church is now a bilingual church. They worship in English and Spanish. It was kind of a very small, older congregation, all in English, and it's really, the legal services program has really helped to revitalize the church in many ways. It's drawn in some of these newer families to the town.
So, Chris, unless you had anything else on that, I was just going to take a minute to move to another area. Matt, just in your view, how important is legislation in regard to our ability to show God's love to the foreigner, or treat them in a way that God would have us do? Where does legislation play much of a factor in that, in your eyes? And if so, what specific policies would you like either added or removed in service of that goal?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I wouldn't say legislation or policy is primary, but it does have an impact in a couple of ways. One, for example, I mentioned refugee resettlement. I think that's an incredible missional opportunity. But as a Christian organization, we don't get to decide if a refugee is coming to the United States or not. That's a governmental decision. And so when the government decides no refugees are coming in, or very few refugees are coming in, that's a closed door in terms of, not that there's not already refugees in the country, but in terms of like a ministry of resettlement and welcoming new refugees, we've had to dramatically reduce our footprint in terms of that ministry as the number of refugees has gone down. Really, this year right now, there's been about 1,000 refugees resettled nationally in the first 3 months of 2021. So incredibly low compared to a historic norm. So policy matters to that extent. And the other way that I would say policy matters is it's a way to, I think it's another way that we show love for our neighbors. Martin Luther King Jr., to paraphrase, he once said, if you're going to love your neighbor, of course, you're going to be the good Samaritan to the man beaten up on the side of the road to Jericho. But if the next day someone else is beaten up on the side of the road to Jericho, and the next day someone else is beaten up on the side of the road to Jericho, at a certain point, loving our neighbors means we ask the question of what's wrong with this road? What's not working right? So I think, in my experience, most people who interact with immigrant communities long enough start to recognize some systemic dysfunction that is built into the way our legal systems work. So, specifically, I'd say one of the ways we've seen this most clearly in our work is this category of immigrants called dreamers. So that term comes from a bill that's been introduced every year since 2001, or every Congress for more than 20 years, but has never passed. So for immigrants who are here unlawfully, but they were brought as kids, it's a fairly typical situation that let's say you do the tutoring program, you're helping kids, advance academically. but then they have to fill out the FAFSA form, and it turns out they can't go to college because they don't have a social security number and they don't qualify for any federal financial aid. Or maybe somehow they get a private scholarship and they get to college, and then they realize that they're graduating and they still don't have a social security number, which doesn't, I mean, clearly there's lots of people without social security numbers working in this country, but not usually in the sort of jobs that require a college education. And there's no amount of like extra tutoring that can solve that. I mean, it's a legal issue. So that's where we have been involved in some element of advocacy. And again, I think it's been important to our sort of be in solidarity with the immigrant communities that we're serving, in ways that we think are guided by biblical principles that are saying, how do we both honor the law, but also be compassionate? But I wouldn't say it's primary either. I think it starts with that ministry, and often that's sort of the entry point to where we see, could we do better as a nation with some of our legal systems that would be more just and more compassionate?
So Matt, why is, in your opinion, from your perspective, why is that bill not getting passed?
It's a great question. I think it's because it's interesting. There's been lots of polling on this. Literally like 70 to 80% of Americans support that sort of legislation. And that includes the majority of evangelical Christians, the majority of white evangelical Christians, any category you want to look at, the majority of Republicans, the majority of Democrats. It seems like it should be obvious. Honestly, I think the reason it doesn't get passed is because on both sides of the aisle, there are some entrenched interests in having political issues for campaigns and not actually solving problems. I also think that the minority of voters who feel very strongly that they don't want those young people to be able to become permanent residents tend to be much more likely to make phone calls to the members of Congress than those who are supportive. I've had congressional friends who've worked on Capitol Hill who've told me, immigration issues show up in the news and the phone calls just go off the hooks in congressional offices, and it's not usually like a compassionate, sympathetic perspective. And so members of Congress are often presuming that there haven't seemed to have been political consequences to not solving this, but I'm going to offend these voters who might be, primary voters or high propensity voters if I do lead on this. So the easiest thing is just to take the status quo. I see.
So the people who are for it are not strong enough for it that they're making phone calls.
I mean, I hope that changes, but I think that's been the story for most of the last 20 years, at least.
I see.
I will say, I mean, just as a contemporary example of this, World Relief encouraged that sort of advocacy around the refugee ceiling question that I just talked about. Refugees are interesting because it's almost entirely in the president's authority to set the ceiling for refugee resettlement. The Congress gave the president that authority with the Refugee Act of 1980. So a couple of weeks ago, President Biden set the refugee ceiling at 15,000, which we were really disappointed by at World Relief because it was not what he had said he was going to do. As recently as February, his State Department made the case to Congress for why they were going to be changing it to 62,500. So, we set up a petition on our website to encourage the president to keep his commitment. And I'm not saying we were responsible for this entirely. There's a lot of pushback, but it only took a few hours before the president or the White House clarified that, well, they were always going to raise the refugee ceiling further. And that's going to happen apparently by May 15th. Although I will, with any politician, I'm not trying to just single out President Biden, but I will take that as word when I see the paperwork signed, because we've already had at least one commitment that didn't seem to be kept.
Right. Yeah. It was in 1980. It was what, like 225,000?
In 1980, the ceiling was set at 231,000 and change, and I think it was about 220 who actually came in. So a ceiling is not necessarily, you may or may not actually hit the ceiling, which is one of the things it seems like the administration right now has forgotten. Like they're saying, well, we're going to set a 15,000 ceiling and then maybe we'll raise it again, and then maybe we'll raise it again. And my thought was like, well, that's not how a ceiling works. Like my daughter, who's 3 years old, is, about 3 feet tall. We're not going to build a 3-foot ceiling in her bedroom. Like you set a ceiling for the maximum that you might need. That's sort of the definition of a ceiling.
Yeah. I remember doing a sermon on it, and I just looked up some old notes that I had. I did a sermon on a few years ago, and the ceiling dropped significantly after 1984, and then Bush Senior increased it, and then Bill Clinton dropped it down to under 100. And it's been hovering between 70 and 85,000 for the first, under Bush Jr. and Obama. Is that correct?
Yep. And Obama pushed it up to 110 his last year in office, but then he didn't see the end of that year. So it actually, President Trump then lowered it down to 50 and then down every year down to 15. And that's what Biden has at this moment kept it at. So it is, again, it's not a partisan thing either. Some of our highest refugee ceilings, our highest refugee ceiling ever was under President Carter. Our second highest, I believe, was under George H.W. Bush. And then the third was under Reagan. So this wasn't historically a partisan distinction. I mean, frankly, it was responding to global dynamics. I mean, it was high under Carter and the first part of the Reagan administration because of the crisis in Vietnam.
Right.
And even before the Refugee Act was passed, this was under some more informal authority, but under President Ford, very high numbers as well.
Yeah.
And Matt, under COVID times, are we likely to even come close to hitting that ceiling if they raise it to 62, or I mean, can we even get to 15 if people really aren't being allowed to move between, between countries?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this point, certainly a year ago, COVID had everything shut down, and understandably so. At this point, I mean, they're testing everyone before they get on an airplane, and frankly, there are hot spots right now globally, India, Brazil, but most of the places the refugees are coming from are not necessarily any worse with COVID than the United States, and in many cases are lower rates of infection. So there's not a lot of public health risk if someone is tested before they get on an airplane, and at this point, you can vaccinate them very quickly as well. And by the way, I don't know that COVID vaccination is required yet, but there's all sorts of requirements for vaccinations for refugees before they get on a plane to begin with. So I don't think it's the public health dynamic. What is an issue is, as the numbers have been reduced, the refugee vetting process usually takes at least a year to complete. So from when a refugee is being considered by the U.S. government to when they've completed all their background checks and their public health screening is usually going to take at least a year. And frankly, nobody was starting that process a year ago for 125,000 refugees to come in this year. They were not doing that, so, and the longer, that would sort of be a critique of the Trump administration a year ago, but the Biden administration has not ramped it up nearly as quickly as I would have liked to have seen. We're not in any way asking to cut corners on that vetting process, but there's plenty of people globally who, could be at the front of the line to begin that process. There are right now about 35,000 refugees globally who have been approved by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service for resettlement. That is to say, they've gone through that process. So I don't know if the Biden administration can get to 62,500 this year, but they certainly could get more than 15,000. And again, for us, this is personal because it's literally, I mean, I have a colleague in Memphis, Osuze. He's Congolese. He's been here probably 5 or 6 years. His brother came a few years ago, and his brother's wife, Osuze's sister-in-law, is stuck in Africa and in really desperate situations, very much eager to be with her husband in Memphis. And her flight was booked in March by the U.S., because the U.S. State Department thought they were going to raise the ceiling. And then when the president didn't do so, they canceled their flight. And she's, to my knowledge, still not been rebooked. So, we're interacting with family members on this side who are just desperate to have their loved ones with them, who have gone through this whole process, and then with starts and stops and changes to U.S. policy are often kept apart. I mean, we have a number of stories like that are, it's really heartbreaking to have to tell someone, sorry, we don't know when your wife's coming.
And Matt, for our edification, I've looked this up and seen that the Congo is like the biggest supplier of refugees in recent years. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I think last year.
Why is that?
Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is maybe, I'm not sure, in distinction to the Republic of Congo, which is next door, has been basically on and off in civil war for 50 years. And there are sort of tribal ethnic divisions that are largely at play there. And yeah, actually, World Relief does a lot of work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's a lot of really beautiful work happening. It's also a largely Christian country at this point. Lots of really vibrant Christian faith, but also a lot of ethnic and tribal divisions that have been horrifically violent for a number of years. So a lot of the folks that we resettle, that we're able to receive from the Democratic Republic of Congo have been in camps for 10 or 15 or 20 years. In fact, there's a whole community, and that's not that atypical. I mean, the other group that I think is rivals Congo in terms of overall numbers for settlement to the U.S. is from Burma. And a lot of those folks, they're different ethnic minority groups for the most part, but a lot of them are largely Christian groups. And some of them were in camps for 15 or 20 years before they got the opportunity for a settlement in Thailand. And then others are not in camps. They're basically living kind of pseudo legally, like they're being tolerated in Malaysia, but also they're not allowed to work, which means that they probably are working, because otherwise how are you, paying for a place to live and for food? But then they're also afraid of the police there. So it's they're very complicated situations. And yeah, I think Congo and Burma are the top two countries of origin in the last few years. Going back a little further, we had a lot of Iraqis, which were a good percentage of those, about a third, were Christians, and that was the part of their persecution claim. The most common story there is people who serve the U.S. military, so translators for the U.S. Army or Navy or Marines or whatever, or Air Force, and as a result, terrorist groups have kind of targeted people. And frankly, that's something we're concerned about with Afghanistan right now as well. Without commenting on the decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, there's a real possibility that there could be people who were associated with the United States in that very long war who could, depending what happens there, could be at risk in the coming years, which is not, there could be a parallel to the beginning of the refugee resettlement program out of Vietnam. I mean, it was people from South Vietnam who had been allied to the United States who, when the U.S. left, within a few years, Saigon fell and they were at risk.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up, because I'd seen that report and I didn't know the origin of why Burma and the Democratic Republic of Congo seem to be the main providers of refugees in recent years.
Yeah.
But we're running up against the time, and I apologize for my delays in the beginning. But Chris, unless you had anything else, I did just want to finish up if Matt had some specific action points or organizations or ways that, people who are so inclined could help, unless you had anything else, Chris.
No, yeah, Matt, if you can, if you have a little bullet, I mean, I'm going to go back to these podcasts and come up with a bullet point list, and Tom and I will draft something for our website. But if you have just like a bullet point list and that you can rattle off for us, that's what you want.
Yeah, if you can certainly list your organization and ways they can help with that, or other organizations that they can get involved with specifically as we can, just so people have some ways that they can get involved if they feel moved to do so, even if it's prayer or what have you.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. So two kind of, World Relief, where I work, would be a good resource, so worldrelief.org. Unfortunately, we don't have an office in New Jersey right now. At one point, maybe we will, but we don't at the moment. But there's a ton of resources there, just in terms of discipleship resources and other ways that we can serve churches kind of at a distance as well. The other source I would recommend is something called the Evangelical Immigration Table, and that's a coalition that World Relief is a part of, but also the National Association of Evangelicals and the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and a bunch of other Christian groups. And there's just a bunch of resources there on both ideas for ministry to and with immigrants, discipleship resources as people are trying to think through, how do I think about these issues from a biblical perspective, advocacy tools and resources for those who want to address some of the public policy questions. So that's evangelicalimmigration.com.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. And then can I just follow up? My wife and I are licensed foster parents, and we have been for the last 2 years. We haven't gotten a placement yet, but we recently got contacted by the state foster system, I guess on behalf of Homeland Security, asking if we would be willing to take in a child who got caught up in the border crisis, at the southern border, temporarily, until things get worked out for them. And we were told that families, that although they are looking at foster families first, that other families can sign up to do that if they want. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's a program. It's run, the federal government runs it through a few different organizations. The Catholic bishops and the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services are the two largest, and then Bethany Christian Services as well is a third that partners with them. Those are the three organizations that I know. So they do, sort of, all of them also do foster care, in the domestic population. They're not everywhere, so they're not in every community, but they are expanding right now because the needs are greater. So they're looking and opening what's called transitional foster care. So it's not like towards adoption. It's usually just for a short-term stay,
Right.
because most of these kids actually have family in the United States,
Yeah.
but it can take time to verify who their family is and where they are. And obviously the goal of the federal government is to get them out of huge shelters, or even worse, border patrol stations that are kind of jail-like.
Yeah.
So it's a huge ministry, and a huge ministry need. And it does obviously require, you have to be licensed, and for good reasons. There's lots of background checks and things like that. But I'm not exactly sure what's going on there in New Jersey, but I know in a number of states that's run either through like Catholic Charities or Bethany Christian Services.
Okay, so you have to be licensed in some. So you don't have to be licensed with the foster system, but you have to be licensed with one of these organizations.
You definitely have to be licensed with one of the organizations. I'm not exactly sure what their processes are. And I know that they love Spanish-speaking foster families because that's a particular need, but they also don't require everyone to be, they would not have enough families if that was a requirement of every case. So
yeah. We said yes, but we haven't. This was like a month ago, and so we haven't heard back at all. So we don't know. That's kind of our experience with the foster system, period. So maybe it's worth it to look into one of these other organizations. Cool, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys for your interest, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Yeah, thanks for shedding light on it. One kind of neat thing you said before about reaching out to people, just taking them to the grocery store. You said, which is an odd experience here compared to elsewhere. We've hosted a Spanish student for a couple of summers, and even in Spain, with Valencia, perfectly modern city, we brought her to the supermarket here. She's like, this is incredible. I've never seen anything like this. It's a total culture shock just going to ShopRite.
Wow.
So overwhelming for people. Yeah, I mean, we've had families from Sudan or from Somalia for whom it is just, there's actually a really compelling film that captures some of this. It's called The Good Lie. It's like dramatized, but it's a very, that part of the film is quite accurate to like people who have never seen anything like this. It's overwhelming. Like, I just wanted to find something to eat. What do I do with like 10,000 choices?
Yeah.
And it's a reminder to Americans that we take for granted, all the opportunities and privileges we have.
Yeah,
just a neat little aside there that you mentioned. That was funny.
Hey Matt, would you be willing to pray us out and just kind of pray for our church as we kind of seek to jump into this? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. God, thank you so much just for this church and their eagerness to explore your heart for those who are vulnerable to injustice, whether that's the unborn or the victims of trafficking or foreigners, various other categories of people. God, we know that you love those who are on the margins so much, Lord, that you, when you entered this earth as a human being, Jesus, you experienced that yourself. You, as a kid, were fleeing with your family to Egypt, and you know what that experience is like. I pray, God, for this church and for churches all over this country, that our witness as we respond to vulnerable people would be honoring to you, would be serving of them, and ultimately would help build up your church and draw people to you. And pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.